The day my daughter Jessica called me completely invisible at her anniversary dinner, I smiled politely and excused myself to the restroom. But I wasn't crying. I was planning. By the time dessert arrived, I had already decided to show her exactly how visible I could be. Within 6 months, my name was on billboards across 3 counties, my face was in the local newspaper every week, and Jessica was fielding calls from reporters asking about her famous mother. Sometimes the best revenge isn't disappearing. It's becoming impossible to ignore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Mae Patterson, and at 69 years old, I had perfected the art of being overlooked. Not by choice, mind you, but by circumstance. The slow, creeping kind that settles over you like dust on forgotten furniture. I lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in a modest ranch house on Maple Street, where the sidewalks cracked from winter frost and the neighbors still waved from their porches. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, except somehow, nobody really knew mine. For 35 years, I had worked as a seamstress at Henderson's Alterations downtown. My fingers knew the weight of every fabric, could thread a needle in dim light, and had hemmed thousands of wedding dresses, graduation gowns, and funeral suits. I was the invisible woman behind the curtain, literally and figuratively, making sure everyone else looked perfect for their important moments. Mrs. Henderson used to say I had magic fingers, that I could make any garment fit like it was custom made. But when Mrs. Henderson passed and her nephew sold the shop to a chain store, my magic fingers were suddenly obsolete. The new management preferred younger employees who could work faster and cheaper. At 67, I was gently pushed into retirement with a modest pension and a gold watch that stopped working after 3 months. Jessica, my only daughter, lived 20 minutes away in Marion with her husband Brad and their 2 teenagers, Chloe and Tyler. Brad worked in insurance, the kind of man who wore pressed khakis and discussed mortgage rates at dinner parties. Jessica had followed in his footsteps, landing a job at a real estate agency where she specialized in luxury homes for Cedar Rapids' growing professional class. They lived in a pristine subdivision where every lawn was manicured and every driveway hosted matching SUVs. I had raised Jessica alone after her father, Michael, died in a construction accident when she was 12. Those were lean years, filled with double shifts at the shop, coupon clipping, and careful budgeting to make sure Jessica never felt like she was missing out. I sewed her prom dress by hand, a deep blue creation that took me 3 weeks of evenings to perfect. I worked extra hours to pay for her college tuition, her wedding, and the down payment on her first house. I told myself it was what mothers do. We sacrifice quietly, we support from the shadows, we take pride in our children's successes as if they were our own. But after I retired, something shifted. Without the structure of work, without the constant hum of sewing machines and the steady stream of customers, I found myself adrift. I filled my days with small routines. Morning coffee on the back porch, afternoon soap operas, evening crossword puzzles. I joined the library's book club, but the other members were either much younger mothers discussing romance novels or much older widows relitigating their deceased husband's flaws. I didn't fit in either group. I called Jessica every few days, but our conversations grew shorter and more perfunctory. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" "That's good. We're busy with the kids' activities. Tyler made varsity soccer. Chloe's taking AP classes. Brad's working on a big account. I'll call you later." Click. I began to feel like a checkbox on her weekly to-do list. Call Mom, check. The invitations became less frequent, too. Sunday dinners turned into every other Sunday, then once a month. Then, "We'll call you when we know our schedule." Holiday gatherings felt obligatory rather than celebratory. I would arrive with homemade dishes. My famous cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole made from scratch, apple pie with a lattice crust that took hours to weave, and watch as everyone filled their plates with store-bought sides while mine sat barely touched at the end of the table. I started to notice how conversations flowed around me rather than through me. Jessica would discuss her latest real estate deals with Brad, the kids would share school gossip with each other, and I would sit quietly, occasionally offering a comment that would be acknowledged with a polite nod before the conversation moved on. I became the family's silent observer, present but not participating, seen but not heard. The most painful part wasn't the neglect, it was the casual dismissal. When I mentioned wanting to take a pottery class, Jessica said, "That's nice, Mom," without looking up from her phone. When I talked about volunteering at the animal shelter, she responded with, while simultaneously texting someone about a house showing. When I suggested we take a mother-daughter trip to visit my sister in Colorado, Jessica said, "Maybe someday," in the same tone she used to placate her children's requests for a puppy. I began to understand that I had become what sociologists call socially invisible, physically present but emotionally absent from the lives of the people who mattered most to me. I was the woman who showed up, brought food, asked about everyone's day, and left without anyone really noticing I had been there. I was a prop in their family story, not a character with her own narrative arc. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my entire career making other people look good, ensuring their clothes fit perfectly for their special moments. And now I was living my own life in the same way, making sure everyone else's needs were met, while my own faded into the background. I had become so practiced at being accommodating, so skilled at not taking up space, that I had effectively erased myself from my own family's daily experience. But unlike the Mary Louise story that ends with quiet departure, something different was stirring in me. Maybe it was the Iowa stubborn streak that my grandmother always said ran in our family. Or maybe it was the seamstress in me who knew that sometimes you have to rip out all the stitches and start over to make something truly beautiful. Either way, I was beginning to realize that invisible didn't have to be permanent, and that sometimes the most profound transformation happens when you stop trying to fit in and start demanding to be seen. I just didn't know yet that my daughter was about to give me the perfect opportunity to make that transformation happen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The slow erosion of my place in the family became most apparent during what Jessica called special occasions. These were moments that should have brought us together, but instead highlighted just how far apart we had drifted. It started with small things that I initially dismissed as coincidence or oversight, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. There was Mother's Day, for instance. Jessica had called 2 days before to inform me that they would be having brunch at the country club instead of our traditional gathering at my house. "It's just easier, Mom," she explained, her voice carrying that efficient tone she used with difficult clients. "The kids have activities afterward, and Brad's parents are in town." I wasn't invited to the country club brunch. Instead, I received a flower arrangement delivered to my door, beautiful, expensive, and utterly impersonal. The card read, "Happy Mother's Day. Love, Jessica, Brad, Chloe, and Tyler." It was signed by the florist. Then came the 4th of July. For 23 years, I had hosted the family barbecue in my backyard. I had perfected the art of grilling corn on the cob, making homemade ice cream, and organizing games for the kids. My yard wasn't fancy, but it was spacious enough for badminton and had mature oak trees that provided perfect shade. This year, Jessica called to say they were going to Brad's company picnic instead. "It's a networking opportunity," she said, as if that explained everything. "You understand, right, Mom?" I said I understood, but I didn't. I spent the holiday alone, watching fireworks from my back porch and eating a hamburger I'd grilled for one. The most telling incident happened during Tyler's high school graduation. I had been looking forward to this milestone for months, had even bought fabric to sew a new dress for the occasion. The ceremony was held at the school's football stadium, and I arrived early to get a good seat. I found Jessica, Brad, and Chloe in the bleachers and waved excitedly. Jessica gave me a tight smile and a small wave back, but when I climbed up to sit with them, I realized they had saved seats for Brad's parents, who were flying in from Phoenix. There was no space for me. "Mom, you can sit behind us," Jessica said without looking up from her phone. "We need to save these seats for Brad's family." I stood there for a moment, holding my purse and the congratulatory gift I had carefully wrapped for Tyler, feeling like an intruder at my own grandson's graduation. I ended up sitting 3 rows behind them, watching the backs of their heads as they celebrated Tyler's achievement. When the ceremony ended and families rushed onto the field for photos, I waited for someone to call me over. Nobody did. I took a few pictures from a distance with my old camera, then drove home alone. That night, I saw the graduation photos on Jessica's Facebook page. There were dozens of them. Tyler in his cap and gown, family group shots, candid moments of celebration. Brad's parents featured prominently in most of the images, proud grandparents beaming beside their successful grandson. I appeared in exactly 2 photos, both taken from far away where I was barely recognizable. The caption read, "So proud of our graduate. Family celebration with the grandparents." I wasn't even mentioned by name. Far away was it. The pattern extended to smaller, everyday interactions as well. When Jessica did visit my house, usually to drop off the kids while she ran errands, she would spend the entire time on her phone, conducting business or planning social events that didn't include me. She would walk through my living room like she was inspecting a property, occasionally commenting on things that needed updating or repair. "Mom, you really should get rid of that old couch," she said once, not looking up from her phone. "It's dated." The couch was where she used to curl up with me as a child, reading books and watching movies on rainy afternoons. Chloe and Tyler, now 17 and 15 respectively, had evolved into polite strangers. They would hug me dutifully when they arrived and thank me for any snacks I offered, but they spent most of their time absorbed in their devices or homework. When I tried to engage them in conversation about school, friends, or their interests, I received monosyllabic responses that made it clear they were just being polite. I understood that teenagers were naturally self-absorbed, but the distance felt deliberate rather than developmental. The most painful realization came during a conversation I overheard between Jessica and Brad one evening when they thought I was in the bathroom. They were discussing their upcoming vacation to Florida, making plans for flights and hotel reservations. "Should we invite your mom?" Brad asked. There was a long pause before Jessica responded. "I don't think so. She'd just complain about the heat, and you know how she gets around crowds. Plus, the kids want to do more active things. She'd just slow us down." They weren't being malicious, they were being practical. But practicality, I realized, is just a polite word for convenient dismissal. I began to notice how my contributions to family gatherings were received with the same polite acknowledgement one might give to a piece of furniture that serves its purpose but isn't particularly noteworthy. My homemade dishes were eaten, but not praised. My gifts were opened, but not treasured. My presence was accepted, but not desired. I had become the family's obligation rather than its joy. The breaking point was building slowly, like pressure in a kettle. I started keeping a journal. Not out of self-pity, but out of a growing need to document what was happening to me. I wrote down conversations, recorded incidents, noted the dates and times when I felt most invisible. Reading back through those entries, I could see the pattern clearly. I was being systematically erased from my own family's life, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, persistent practice of being treated as optional. But unlike the protagonist in the original story, I wasn't planning to disappear. Something else was stirring in me, a rebellion that had been dormant for too long. I had spent decades being accommodating, understanding, and selfless. I had prioritized everyone else's comfort over my own needs, everyone else's dreams over my own aspirations. I had been the perfect supporting character in other people's stories, but I was beginning to realize that I had never been the protagonist of my own. The seamstress in me understood that sometimes you have to cut away the damaged fabric before you can create something beautiful. The Iowa farm girl in me, the one who had learned to be tough from watching my grandmother weather every storm, was beginning to stir. And the woman who had raised a daughter alone while working 2 jobs was remembering that she had always been stronger than she appeared. I just didn't know yet that Jessica was about to give me the perfect opportunity to remind everyone exactly who Dorothy Mae Patterson really was. The anniversary dinner that would change everything was still 3 weeks away, but the woman who would walk into that restaurant was already being born in the quiet spaces between their dismissals and my growing determination to be seen. The anniversary dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Jessica and Brad were marking 15 years of marriage at Lighthouse Restaurant, Cedar Rapids' most upscale dining establishment. The invitation had come 3 days before the event, delivered not through a phone call or personal visit, but via a group text that included Brad's parents, his sister, and Jessica's college roommate who was visiting from Chicago. Anniversary dinner Saturday, 7 p.m. at Lighthouse. Cocktails at 6:30. Please confirm attendance. It was signed J and B, as if they were a corporate entity, rather than my daughter and son-in-law. I confirmed my attendance with a simple, yes, looking forward to it, though part of me wondered if I should have been more enthusiastic in my response. I spent considerable time preparing for the evening. This felt like an important occasion, not just their anniversary, but an opportunity to reconnect with Jessica, to be part of something meaningful rather than just another obligation to be managed. I selected a navy blue dress that I had sewn myself 2 years earlier but never found the right occasion to wear. It was elegant without being flashy, with subtle beading along the neckline that caught the light beautifully. I styled my silver hair in a low chignon and wore the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. Looking in the mirror, I felt confident and dignified, like a woman who belonged at a celebration. The restaurant was everything I had heard it would be. White tablecloths, crystal stemware, soft jazz playing in the background, and a view of the Cedar River through floor-to-ceiling windows. I arrived precisely at 6:30, not wanting to be late, but also not wanting to be the first one there. Jessica and Brad were already at the bar with his parents, Robert and Linda, who had driven down from Dubuque for the occasion. They were engaged in animated conversation about a golf trip they were planning to Arizona. "Mom," Jessica called out when she saw me, her voice carrying the bright, performative tone she used in professional settings. "You look nice. Come meet everyone." I walked over to join the group, noticing how naturally they had formed a circle that seemed complete without me. I had to position myself slightly behind Jessica to join the conversation, like a latecomer trying to catch up. The cocktail hour proceeded with polite exchanges about weather, travel plans, and Brad's recent promotion at the insurance company. I contributed when appropriate, sharing updates about my book club and volunteer work at the library, but I noticed how quickly the conversation moved past my contributions to return to topics that engaged the others more fully. Linda dominated much of the discussion, regaling us with stories about their recent cruise and their country club's upcoming fundraiser. She was the type of woman who spoke in exclamation points and had opinions about everything from restaurant service to politics. When we moved to the dining room, I found myself seated at the far end of the table, next to Jessica's college roommate, Sarah, who was pleasant, but clearly more interested in catching up with Jessica than in getting to know me. The seating arrangement felt deliberate. I was positioned where I could observe the celebration without being central to it. Brad's parents sat on either side of the guests of honor, with Brad's sister directly across from them. The conversation flowed naturally between these core participants while Sarah and I occupied the periphery. The meal itself was exquisite. I ordered the salmon with wild rice, savoring flavors I rarely experienced at home. The wine was good, better than what I usually purchased for myself, and the atmosphere was genuinely lovely. But as the evening progressed, I began to feel like I was watching a performance, rather than participating in a celebration. The stories being shared were about experiences I hadn't been part of, family vacations, holiday traditions, inside jokes that predated my inclusion in their lives. It was during the dessert course that the moment arrived. Brad had just finished telling a story about their honeymoon in Cancun, and everyone was laughing at his impression of a particularly enthusiastic tour guide. In the momentary lull that followed, I seized the opportunity to contribute to the conversation. "That reminds me of the time Jessica and I went to the Wisconsin Dells when she was 12. I began, smiling at the memory. "She was so excited about the water slides, but when we got there, she was too scared to go down the big one. So I went first to show her it was safe, and I ended up losing my swimsuit top halfway down." I laughed, expecting others to join in with the kind of warm family humor that marks intimate celebrations. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence. Jessica's face flushed slightly, and she looked down at her dessert plate. Brad cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. Linda raised an eyebrow and exchanged a glance with her husband. "Mom," Jessica said quietly, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard before. Not angry, but embarrassed. That's not really appropriate dinner conversation." I felt my cheeks burn. "I'm sorry, I just thought." "It's fine," Jessica interrupted, but her tone suggested it wasn't fine at all. "It's just, we don't need to hear about your swimsuit malfunctions." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah tried to fill the void by asking about the restaurant's wine selection, but the damage was done. I had committed some social transgression that I didn't fully understand, and now I was being managed like a child who had spoken out of turn. As the conversation resumed around topics that didn't include me, I sat quietly, trying to process what had just happened. I had shared a harmless, humorous memory from Jessica's childhood, the kind of story that usually bonds families together through shared laughter. But somehow my contribution had been deemed inappropriate, embarrassing, unwelcome. It was then that I overheard the comment that would change everything. Jessica was leaning toward Sarah, speaking in what she thought was a whisper but was clearly audible to me. I swear, sometimes I think she's completely invisible to social cues. She just says whatever comes to mind without thinking about the setting or the audience. Sarah nodded sympathetically. That's tough. Some people just don't have that filter, especially as they get older. Exactly, Jessica continued. It's like she's completely invisible to how she comes across. She doesn't realize that not everything is about her or her memories. Sometimes I wish she would just blend into the background more. The word hit me like a physical blow. Invisible. Not just invisible to social cues, but invisible to the very fabric of appropriate behavior. Invisible to the standards of the family I had helped create. In Jessica's mind, my greatest contribution would be to disappear entirely, to blend into the background so completely that I wouldn't risk embarrassing her with my presence. I sat there for the remainder of the evening, smiling politely and speaking only when directly addressed. I watched Jessica laugh with her in-laws, watched Brad tell stories about his work achievements, watched everyone celebrate their life together, while I occupied the space of the unwanted guest who had overstayed her welcome. When the evening ended, and we were saying our goodbyes in the parking lot, Jessica hugged me briefly and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom. Drive safely." There was no invitation to get together soon, no mention of the next family event, no acknowledgement that anything uncomfortable had happened. I was being dismissed as efficiently as she would dismiss a client after a successful house showing. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Rapids, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The hurt was there, certainly, but it was being rapidly replaced by something else, a clarity that cut through years of accumulated disappointment and self-doubt. Jessica wanted me to be invisible? She thought I didn't understand social cues or appropriate behavior? She wished I would blend into the background? I had spent my entire adult life being accommodating, understanding, and quietly supportive. I had raised her alone while working full-time, had sacrificed my own dreams to ensure hers could flourish, had been the steady, reliable presence in her life that she could count on, without question. And now, in her moment of success and celebration, she saw me as an embarrassment to be managed, rather than a person to be honored. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew Dorothy Mae Patterson. If Jessica wanted to see what invisible looked like, she was about to learn the difference between being overlooked and being impossible to ignore. The woman who had spent decades in the background was about to step into the spotlight, and everyone, especially my daughter, was going to see exactly what they had been missing. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I woke before dawn with the kind of clarity that comes after a fever breaks. The hurt was still there, pulsing beneath my ribs like a bruise, but it was no longer the dominant feeling. What had taken its place was something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that made my fingers tingle with anticipation. I made my coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped Jessica with her homework, where I had balanced my checkbook during those lean years, where I had eaten countless solitary meals in recent months. But this morning it felt different. This morning it felt like a war room. I pulled out a yellow legal pad, the kind I used to use for sewing patterns, and wrote at the top, "Dorothy Mae Patterson, a life reclaimed." Then I drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left side I wrote what I've been. On the right side I wrote what I'm becoming. Under what I've been, I listed invisible, accommodating, background support, convenient, forgettable, obligatory, dismissible. Under what I'm becoming, I paused. The pen hovered over the paper as I considered what I truly wanted. Not revenge, exactly. Not punishment. Something bigger than that. Something that would make it impossible for Jessica, or anyone else, to ever call me invisible again. I wrote, visible, purposeful, independent, remarkable, unforgettable, newsworthy, inspiring, Crelidio. That last word surprised me. Inspiring, yes, that felt right. I wanted to inspire others, particularly women my age, who might be feeling the same creeping invisibility that had nearly consumed me. I wanted to show that 69 was not too old to reinvent yourself, that being dismissed by your own family was not the end of your story but potentially the beginning of a much more interesting chapter. The question was, how? I spent the next 3 days in what I can only describe as a strategic reconnaissance mission. I drove around Cedar Rapids with fresh eyes, observing the city not as a longtime resident but as someone looking for opportunities. I visited the library not to browse for light reading but to research. I studied the local newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, analyzing what kinds of stories they covered, what types of people they featured, what captured the community's attention. I learned that Cedar Rapids had been rebuilding its downtown district after the devastating floods of 2008. There were new businesses opening, community revitalization projects, and a growing emphasis on celebrating local entrepreneurs and innovators. The city was hungry for positive stories, for examples of resilience and reinvention. I also discovered that the local television station, KCRG, had a weekly segment called Hometown Heroes that featured ordinary people doing extraordinary things. But most importantly, I learned something about myself that I had forgotten. I was not actually ordinary. I had skills, experiences, and knowledge that were valuable. I had just been living in a context where those things were taken for granted, or dismissed as irrelevant. I had been sewing for over 50 years. I could create garments from scratch, alter anything to fit perfectly, and restore vintage pieces to their original beauty. I had an eye for design, an understanding of construction that went beyond basic hem adjustments. I had learned from Mrs. Henderson, who had learned from her grandmother, who had brought sewing techniques from Europe. I was part of a tradition that was rapidly disappearing in an era of fast fashion and disposable clothing. More than that, I had business experience. I had run Henderson's alterations for the last 15 years of Mrs. Henderson's life, managing inventory, dealing with suppliers, handling customer service, and maintaining the books. I had trained newer employees and solved problems that would have closed down a lesser establishment. I had kept that shop profitable even as the retail landscape changed around it. I also had something else. Time. Unlimited, unscheduled time to pursue whatever I chose to pursue. No one was depending on me to drive them anywhere, cook their meals, or manage their household. For the first time in decades, my schedule was entirely my own. The plan began to take shape on Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in the library, reading about successful women entrepreneurs who had started businesses after age 60. I came across an article about a woman in Portland who had opened a sustainable fashion boutique at 72, specializing in upcycled vintage clothing and custom alterations. She had been featured in national magazines and had built a thriving business that attracted customers from across the Pacific Northwest. That's when it hit me. I wouldn't just start a business. I would create something that would make Cedar Rapids take notice. I would become the go-to person for sustainable fashion, for custom work, for everything that mass-produced, disposable culture was throwing away. I would turn my supposed irrelevance into expertise, my invisibility into indispensability. But I wouldn't do it quietly. I wouldn't open a little shop in a strip mall and hope people would find me. I would announce myself to the world with the kind of confidence that would make it impossible for anyone, especially Jessica, to ignore me. I drove home and called the one person I knew who understood reinvention, my sister Margaret, who lived in Denver. Margaret was 5 years older than me and had started her own consulting business at 65 after being pushed out of her corporate job. She had always been the more adventurous sister, the one who took risks while I played it safe. "Maggie," I said when she answered the phone, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise not to talk me out of it." "Well, now you've got my attention," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "What's going on, Dorothy?" I told her everything. The gradual disappearance from my own family's life, the anniversary dinner, Jessica's comment about wishing I would blend into the background. I told her about my decision to become visible, about my plan to start a business that would make Cedar Rapids sit up and take notice. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Dorothy," she said finally, "I have been waiting your entire life for you to get mad enough to do something like this." "I'm not mad," I protested. "I'm just determined." "Honey, determined is just mad with a business plan," Margaret laughed. "And it's about time. You've been underestimating yourself for decades. That girl of yours doesn't know what she's dealing with." We talked for 2 hours. Margaret helped me refine my ideas, challenged my assumptions, and offered to invest in my new venture. More importantly, she reminded me of something I had forgotten. I had always been stronger than I appeared. I had raised a daughter alone while working full-time. I had kept a business running during economic downturns. I had survived my husband's death, my forced retirement, and years of being taken for granted. I was not fragile, and I was not finished. By the time I hung up the phone, I had a timeline, a budget, and a name for my new business. Second Stitches, sustainable fashion for the modern woman. I would specialize in custom alterations, vintage restoration, and upcycled clothing. I would offer workshops on sustainable fashion and host events for women who wanted to learn traditional sewing techniques. I would become the authority on conscious consumption in a throwaway world. But more than that, I would document the entire journey. I would blog about my experiences, share my story on social media, and pitch myself to every local media outlet that would listen. I would become the poster child for reinvention, the example of what was possible when you refused to be invisible. That night, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and looked at myself, really looked, for the first time in years. I saw a woman with silver hair that caught the light, hands that were skilled and steady, eyes that were sharp with purpose. I saw someone who had spent decades in the background but was ready to step into the spotlight. Jessica wanted me to be invisible. She was about to learn that some people become more powerful when they're underestimated, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes has nothing left to lose. The transformation began with a single phone call to the Cedar Rapids Gazette on a Tuesday morning in March. I had rehearsed my pitch 3 times in the mirror, written out key talking points on index cards, and psyched myself up with an extra cup of coffee. When the receptionist answered, I asked to speak with someone in the lifestyle section. "This is Rebecca Martinez," came the voice on the other end of the line. "How can I help you?" "Ms. Martinez, my name is Dorothy Patterson, and I have a story that I think your readers would find inspiring. I'm a 69-year-old woman who just started her own sustainable fashion business, and I'm planning to challenge everything people think they know about aging, fashion, and second chances." There was a pause. "Tell me more." I had 30 seconds to make my case, and I didn't waste them. "I'm opening Second Stitches next month, a boutique that specializes in transforming discarded clothing into custom pieces. But here's the hook. I'm doing it to prove that women over 65 aren't invisible, that we have skills and stories that matter, and that retirement doesn't have to mean retreating from the world. I'm documenting the entire journey, and I think your readers would be fascinated by what happens when someone decides to reinvent themselves completely." Rebecca paused again. "That's actually really interesting. Can you come in Thursday afternoon? I'd like to meet you and hear more about this business of yours." That was the moment everything changed. Not the interview itself, but the realization that I had something newsworthy to offer. For the first time in years, someone was interested in my story, not as a polite obligation, but as compelling content. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the interview, like it was a job interview, a college exam, and a first date all rolled into one. I researched Rebecca Martinez and discovered she was a 28-year-old journalist who specialized in human interest stories and local business features. She had written about other entrepreneurs, but none over 50, and certainly none who were using their business as a platform for challenging ageism. I also spent those days finalizing the details of Second Stitches. I had found a perfect location in the New Bow City Market, a trendy indoor marketplace that had become the heart of Cedar Rapids' downtown revitalization. The space was small but bright, with exposed brick walls and large windows that would showcase my work beautifully. The rent was higher than I had initially budgeted, but Margaret had convinced me that location was everything. "You want to be where the action is," she had said during one of our nightly strategy calls. "You want to be where young professionals go for lunch, where couples go for date nights, where tourists go to experience the real Cedar Rapids. You want to be impossible to miss." The lease was signed, the permits were filed, and I had spent my first week's budget on a professional sign that would hang above my storefront. Second Stitches, where fashion gets a second chance. Below that, in smaller letters, custom alterations, vintage restoration, sustainable style. Thursday arrived with unseasonably warm weather that felt like a good omen. I dressed carefully in a navy blazer that I had tailored myself, paired with a vintage silk scarf that I had found at a thrift store and restored to its original beauty. I wanted to look professional, but also to embody what Second Stitches represented, the idea that quality, craftsmanship, and style weren't disposable commodities. The Cedar Rapids Gazette office was located in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel that reflected the afternoon sun. Rebecca Martinez turned out to be exactly what I had imagined: energetic, smart, and genuinely curious about people's stories. She met me in the lobby with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed authentically interested rather than professionally polite. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I have to tell you, your pitch was one of the most intriguing I've received in months. I'm excited to hear more about what you're doing." We sat in a small conference room with large windows overlooking the Cedar River, and I told her everything. Not just about Second Stitches, but about the journey that had led me here. I told her about my career as a seamstress, about raising Jessica alone, about the gradual realization that I had become invisible in my own family's life. I told her about the anniversary dinner, about Jessica's comment, about my decision to become visible again. Rebecca took notes furiously, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed she understood the deeper story I was telling. She asked about ageism in the workplace, about the challenges of starting a business at 69, about my goals for Second Stitches beyond just making money. "I want to create a community," I explained. "I want to teach women, especially women my age, that they don't have to accept being overlooked or dismissed. I want to show that experience is valuable, that skills matter, that we have stories worth telling. Second Stitches isn't just a business, it's a statement." "And what about your family?" Rebecca asked gently. "How do they feel about this transformation?" I paused, considering how to answer honestly without seeming bitter. "They don't know about it yet," I said finally. "They've been so busy with their own lives that they haven't noticed I've been planning this, but I think they're going to be surprised." After the interview, Rebecca walked me through the Nubo City Market to see my future storefront. The space was still empty, but I could visualize exactly how it would look. A comfortable seating area where clients could discuss their projects, display cases showcasing restored vintage pieces, and a work area where people could watch me transform their clothing in real time. "This is going to be incredible," Rebecca said, taking photos of the space and of me standing in front of the future Second Stitches sign. "I want to do a feature story when you open, but I also want to pitch this to our Sunday magazine section. Your story has all the elements of a really compelling human interest piece." The article appeared 3 weeks later, timed perfectly with Second Stitches' grand opening. The headline read, "From Invisible to Inspiring, Local Woman Reinvents Herself at 69. The story was accompanied by professional photos of me in my workshop, detailed descriptions of my unique approach to sustainable fashion, and a sidebar about the growing movement of older entrepreneurs. But the real magic happened in the days following the article's publication. My phone started ringing with interview requests from local radio stations. KCRG reached out about featuring me on their Hometown Heroes segment. The Iowa City Press-Citizen wanted to do a follow-up story about women entrepreneurs. Even a blogger from Des Moines requested an interview about sustainable fashion trends. More importantly, customers started arriving. Not just the occasional browser, but people who had read the article and were specifically seeking out Second Stitches. They brought vintage dresses that needed updating, formal wear that needed altering, and stories of their own about feeling invisible or overlooked. Within my first week, I had booked enough appointments to keep me busy for the next month. The grand opening event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in April. I had planned a modest celebration, some light refreshments, a few demonstrations of my restoration techniques, and maybe a small crowd of curious neighbors. Instead, I found myself preparing for what the Nubo City Market manager called the busiest opening event we've ever hosted. Over 200 people showed up. There were women my age who had read the article and wanted to meet the woman who had inspired them to consider their own reinventions. There were young professionals who were interested in sustainable fashion. There were local business owners who wanted to network with Cedar Rapids' newest entrepreneur. There were even a few men who had brought clothing that needed expert alteration. But the most satisfying moment came when I overheard a conversation between two women who were examining a vintage coat I had restored. "Can you believe she just started this business at 69? One said to the other. "I'm 55 and I've been thinking about making a career change, but I thought I was too old. If Dorothy Patterson can do this, maybe I can too." That's when I knew I had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. I wasn't just running a business. I was inspiring others to reconsider their own possibilities. I wasn't just visible. I was becoming a symbol of what was possible when you refused to accept other people's limitations. The only person who didn't attend the grand opening was Jessica. She had received an invitation, along with a copy of the newspaper article, but she hadn't responded. I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't disappointed either. She would hear about second stitches eventually, probably from someone else who had read about her mother's remarkable transformation. And when she did, she would realize that the woman she had dismissed as invisible had become the most talked about entrepreneur in Cedar Rapids. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in May, just as I was closing up second stitches after another busy day. I had been in business for 6 weeks, and the steady stream of customers had become a constant source of amazement and gratitude. But nothing had prepared me for the voice on the other end of the line. "Is this Dorothy Patterson?" The voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of a Chicago accent. "Yes, this is Dorothy." "Miss Patterson? My name is Amanda Chen, and I'm a producer with Good Morning Iowa. We'd like to feature you on our show next week. We've been following your story since the Cedar Rapids Gazette article, and we think our viewers would be inspired by your journey." I sat down heavily in my work chair, surrounded by the soft fabrics and careful stitching that had become my daily world. Good Morning Iowa was the state's premier morning television show, broadcast from Des Moines but watched across the entire state. This was not local news anymore. This was statewide recognition. Yes, I'd be honored, I managed to say, though my heart was racing. What would the segment involve? "We'd like to bring you to our Des Moines studio for a live interview, maybe 8 minutes of airtime. We'd want to talk about your business, your story, and the message you're sharing with women across Iowa. We're also hoping you might bring some examples of your work, before and after pieces that show what you do." After we hung up, I stood in my shop for a long moment, looking around at what had become my second life. The walls were lined with completed projects waiting for pickup. A 1960s cocktail dress that I had taken in and updated with modern styling, a men's suit that had been altered to fit perfectly after a significant weight loss, a vintage wedding dress that I had restored for a bride who wanted to wear her grandmother's gown. Each piece told a story, represented a relationship, marked a moment when someone had trusted me with something precious. The Good Morning Iowa appearance was scheduled for the following Thursday. I spent the week preparing with the same meticulous attention I brought to my sewing. I selected 3 of my best restoration projects to showcase, practiced my talking points, and even drove to Des Moines the day before to familiarize myself with the studio location. But the real preparation was emotional. I had to confront the fact that after Thursday morning, Dorothy Mae Patterson of Cedar Rapids would no longer be a local success story. I would be a statewide figure, someone whose name and face would be recognized across Iowa. The invisibility that had defined my life for so long would be permanently, irreversibly shattered. The morning of the show, I woke at 4 a.m. and drove through the pre-dawn darkness to Des Moines. The studio was a buzz of activity, cameras being positioned, lighting adjusted, producers conferring in hushed tones. I was escorted to a green room where I sipped coffee and tried to calm my nerves by reviewing my notes one last time. "Dorothy, you're gonna be great," Amanda Chen said when she came to collect me. "Just be yourself. Tell your story the way you told it to Rebecca Martinez. Our viewers are going to love you." The interview was everything I had hoped for and more. The host, Tom Bradley, was warm and genuinely interested in my journey. He asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of starting a business at 69, about the importance of sustainable fashion, and about my message to women who might be feeling invisible in their own lives. But it was the moment when I showed the restored wedding dress that the interview truly came alive. I had brought the before and after photos, showing how I had taken a yellowed, torn 1950s gown and transformed it into something that looked like it had been created yesterday. The camera zoomed in on the delicate hand stitching, the careful repair work, the way I had updated the silhouette while preserving the dress's original character. "This is incredible," Tom said, examining the photos. "You've not just repaired this dress, you've given it new life." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do," I replied, and I could hear the confidence in my own voice. "I'm not just restoring clothing. I'm restoring the idea that things have value, that they're worth preserving and improving rather than discarding." And I think that applies to people too. Just because something, or someone, has been overlooked doesn't mean they don't have incredible potential. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By the time I drove home to Cedar Rapids that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Women from across Iowa were calling to schedule appointments, to share their own stories of feeling invisible, to ask for advice about starting their own businesses. I had orders for restoration work coming in from as far away as Sioux City and Davenport. But the most significant call came 2 days later. It was from Jessica. "Mom." Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear something underneath. Surprise, maybe even a hint of pride. "I saw you on Good Morning Iowa." "Oh." I kept my voice neutral. "I didn't know you watched that show." "I don't, usually. But my friend Sarah called me and said I needed to see it. She recorded it for me." There was a pause. "Mom, I had no idea you were... I didn't know you had started a business." "I sent you an invitation to the grand opening," I said gently, "and a copy of the newspaper article." Another pause. "I know. We were busy that weekend." "But Mom, this is incredible. You're on television, you're in the newspaper, everyone's talking about you. How did you... "I decided to stop being invisible," I said simply. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything that had been said and unsaid over the past months. Finally, Jessica spoke again. Could I maybe come see the shop? I'd like to understand what you're doing." That conversation led to Jessica's first visit to Second Stitches the following Saturday. She arrived with Chloe, who was now 18 and about to graduate from high school. They walked through my shop with obvious amazement, examining the restored pieces, running their fingers along the careful stitching, reading the thank you notes from satisfied customers that I had pinned to a bulletin board. "Grandma," Chloe said, her voice full of genuine admiration, "this is so cool. I had no idea you could do stuff like this." "I've been doing stuff like this for 50 years, I said, not unkindly. "You just weren't paying attention." Jessica flinched at that, but she didn't argue. She was examining a vintage leather jacket that I had completely restored, replacing the lining, repairing the zippers, and conditioning the leather until it looked brand new. "This is museum-quality work, Mom," she said quietly. I never realized how skilled you are." "I tried to tell you," I said, "but you were usually too busy to listen." We spent 2 hours in the shop that afternoon. Jessica asked questions about my techniques, my business model, my future plans. Chloe wanted to know if I could teach her some basic sewing skills. For the first time in years, they were seeing me not as an obligation or an embarrassment, but as a person with expertise and stories worth hearing. But the real breakthrough came when Jessica asked about the anniversary dinner. "Mom, about that night at the restaurant, I said some things that were..." She struggled for words. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I thought you weren't paying attention to social cues. But you were paying attention to everything, weren't you? You were just waiting for the right moment to show us who you really are." "I wasn't waiting for anything," I said. "I was just tired of being invisible." And you made it very clear that night that invisible was exactly what you wanted me to be. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I was embarrassed, but not by you. I was embarrassed by how I was treating you, and I was trying to cover it up by making it your fault. You didn't deserve that. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much had happened for that, but it was a beginning. Jessica started bringing her friends to Second Stitches, recommending my services to her real estate clients, even posting about my work on her social media accounts. She was learning to see me not as her aging mother who needed to be managed, but as Dorothy Patterson, entrepreneur and craftsperson. The transformation was complete in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had wanted to become visible, and I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. But more than that, I had reclaimed my identity, my purpose, and my place in the world. I was no longer defined by what I had been or what others expected me to be. I was defined by what I chose to become. And the best part was, this was just the beginning. Second Stitches was thriving, I had a waiting list of customers, and I was already planning to expand my services to include sewing classes and workshops on sustainable fashion. I was becoming not just visible, but influential, a voice for women who had been overlooked and underestimated. The woman who had once been called invisible was now impossible to ignore. September brought an opportunity that would change everything once again. I was working on a particularly challenging restoration, a 1940s evening gown that had been severely damaged by water and time, when my phone rang with a call that would reshape my entire understanding of what Second Stitches could become. Miss Patterson, this is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the University of Iowa's School of Art and Art History. I hope you don't mind my calling, but I've been following your story in the media, and I have a proposition that might interest you. Dr. Morrison explained that the university was launching a new program called Living Heritage Arts, designed to preserve traditional crafts and skills that were in danger of being lost to modernization. They were looking for master craftspeople who could teach these skills to graduate students while also documenting their techniques for future generations. Your work represents exactly what we're trying to preserve, she said. The kind of skilled tailoring and restoration techniques that were once commonplace but are now becoming rare. We'd like to offer you a position as a visiting master craftsperson, teaching 1 day a week while continuing to run your business. I was speechless. At 69, I was being offered a university position, not as a courtesy or token gesture, but because my skills were considered academically valuable. The girl who had barely finished high school because she needed to work to support her family was being recognized as a master craftsperson by one of the state's most prestigious institutions. I would be honored, I managed to say, but I should tell you, I don't have a college degree. I learned everything through apprenticeship and experience. Miss Patterson, Dr. Morrison said with a laugh, you have something far more valuable than a degree. You have 50 years of hands-on expertise and the ability to transform discarded materials into works of art. That's exactly what we need. The teaching position began in October, and it opened up a world I had never imagined. My students were graduate students in museum studies, art history, and textile preservation. They were young, educated, and eager to learn from someone who had mastered skills their textbooks could only describe in theory. But more than that, they were fascinated by my story. Here was a woman who had started a successful business at 69, who had used media attention to build a platform for social change, who had transformed personal dismissal into public recognition. They saw me not just as a craftsperson, but as a case study in reinvention and empowerment. Word of my university position spread quickly through Cedar Rapids and beyond. The local media picked up the story, and suddenly I was being described not just as a successful entrepreneur, but as an expert whose knowledge was valuable enough to be preserved by the state's leading university. The headlines read, "From invisible to irreplaceable, Cedar Rapids woman becomes university master craftsperson." The recognition brought new challenges and opportunities. I was invited to speak at conferences about sustainable fashion and traditional crafts. The Iowa Small Business Association asked me to mentor other women entrepreneurs. A documentary filmmaker from Chicago reached out about creating a short film about my journey for a series on women who refuse to be invisible. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. My own family's extended network. Brad's sister, who had been at the anniversary dinner where this all began, called to ask if I would be willing to speak at her company's annual Women's Leadership Conference. "Dorothy," she said, "I've been following your story, and I have to tell you, it's been eye-opening. I've been thinking about that dinner, about how we all treated you. I want to make it right, and I think our conference attendees would benefit from hearing your message." The conference was held at the Cedar Rapids Marriott in November, with over 300 professional women in attendance. I was scheduled to deliver the keynote address, From Invisible to Influential, Redefining Success After 60. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, women of all ages, from recent college graduates to established executives, I felt the full weight of how dramatically my life had changed. 9 months earlier, I had been sitting at an anniversary dinner being told I was invisible. Now I was being asked to share my expertise with women who were actively seeking to learn from my experience. "Ladies," I began, "I want to tell you about the most liberating moment of my life. It was the moment I realized that being dismissed by people who should have valued me was not a reflection of my worth. It was an opportunity to show them what they had been missing." The speech was a success, beyond anything I had imagined. Women lined up afterward to shake my hand, to share their own stories of feeling overlooked, to ask for advice about starting their own businesses or pursuing dreams they had put on hold. I exchanged business cards with potential clients, collaborators, and mentors. But the most meaningful moment came when a woman approached me near the end of the event. She was about my age, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from professional success. "Ms. Patterson," she said, "I'm Margaret Walsh, CEO of Walsh Financial Services. I've been following your story since the television appearance, and I want you to know that you've inspired me to make some changes in my own life. I've been thinking about retirement, about stepping back, about becoming less visible. But watching what you've accomplished has made me realize that this might be exactly the wrong time to disappear." That conversation led to an unexpected friendship and business collaboration. Margaret became one of my biggest supporters, recommending second stitches to her network of professional women and eventually investing in my expansion plans. She also introduced me to other successful women entrepreneurs who were looking for ways to give back to their communities. The documentary filmmaker Sarah Chen arrived in December to begin filming. She spent a week in Cedar Rapids, interviewing me, my customers, my university students, and my family members. The process was both exhausting and exhilarating. Having someone document my life and treat it as worthy of preservation was still surreal. During one of the filming sessions, Sarah asked me a question that I hadn't fully considered. "Dorothy, what would you say to women who are in the situation you were in 9 months ago, feeling invisible, dismissed by their families, unsure of their worth?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I would tell them that invisible is not a permanent condition, it's a choice. Not their choice, necessarily, but a choice that other people have made about how to see them. And the beautiful thing about choices is that they can be changed. You can't force people to see you differently, but you can become so undeniably visible that ignoring you becomes impossible. The most unexpected twist came during the final day of filming. Sarah had arranged to interview Jessica about her perspective on my transformation. I was nervous about this conversation. Our relationship had improved significantly, but there were still wounds that hadn't fully healed. "I've learned something important about my mother this year," Jessica told the camera. "I thought I knew who she was. The woman who sewed my clothes, who made my lunches, who was always there when I needed her. But I only knew one version of her. I knew the mother version, the supportive background figure. I never knew Dorothy Patterson, the entrepreneur, the master craftsperson, the woman who could build a business from scratch and become a media sensation." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm ashamed that it took her becoming famous for me to really see her. But I'm also proud. I'm proud that she didn't just accept being invisible. I'm proud that she fought back in such a spectacular way. And I'm proud that she's my mother." The documentary, titled Second Stitches, A Second Life, premiered at the Iowa City Film Festival in February and was later picked up by Iowa Public Television. It won an award for Best Short Documentary and was featured in several film festivals across the Midwest. But beyond all the recognition and success, What mattered most was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had reclaimed my story. I was no longer defined by other people's perceptions of my worth. I had become the author of my own narrative, and that narrative was far more interesting and influential than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. The woman who had once been called invisible was now being preserved for posterity, her story documented as an example of what was possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations. And the best part was, this was still just the beginning. 1 year after that devastating anniversary dinner, I found myself standing in front of a crowd of over 500 people at the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame induction ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had been called completely invisible was now being honored alongside pioneering female doctors, judges, and business leaders who had shaped Iowa's history. The nomination had come from an unexpected source: a coalition of my university students, Second Stitch's customers, and women who had attended my various speaking engagements. They had compiled a comprehensive application highlighting not just my business success, but my role in challenging ageism, promoting sustainable practices, and inspiring women to pursue their dreams regardless of their age. Dorothy Mae Patterson, the presenter announced, represents the spirit of reinvention that has always defined Iowa women. At an age when many are encouraged to step back, she stepped forward. When others suggested she become less visible, she chose to become unforgettable. As I walked across the stage to accept the honor, I caught sight of my family in the audience. Jessica was there, of course, but so were Brad, Chloe, and Tyler. Even Brad's parents, Robert and Linda, had made the trip from Dubuque. They were all on their feet, applauding, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was being celebrated, not just acknowledged. But the real validation came from the other women in the audience, hundreds of faces representing every age, profession, and background. Some were women I had worked with directly, others had simply been inspired by my story. They were mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, all united by the recognition that visibility is not given, it's claimed. The speech I gave that evening was different from all the others. Instead of focusing on my business success or media recognition, I talked about the deeper transformation that had occurred over the past year. This honor isn't really about me, I began, looking out at the sea of faces. It's about every woman who has ever been made to feel invisible, disposable, or irrelevant. It's about the understanding that our worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see us clearly. It's determined by our willingness to see ourselves clearly. I shared stories that hadn't made it into the newspaper articles or television interviews. I talked about the nights I had spent questioning whether I was being foolish, whether starting over at 69 was realistic or just desperate. I talked about the fear that had accompanied every bold decision, every media appearance, every moment when I had chosen visibility over safety. But here's what I learned, I continued. Fear and courage aren't opposites. They're companions. Every brave thing I did this year was done in the presence of fear. The difference was that I stopped letting fear make the decisions. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. I could see women nodding in recognition, some wiping away tears, others taking notes as if they were planning their own transformations. To the women here tonight who are feeling invisible in your own lives, whether it's in your families, your workplaces, or your communities, I want you to know that invisibility is not a life sentence. It's a starting point. It's the place where you discover what you're truly capable of when you stop asking for permission to be seen. After the ceremony, the reception was unlike any social event I had ever attended. Instead of polite small talk, I found myself in deep conversations with women who wanted to share their own stories of feeling overlooked and their plans for changing that. A retired teacher told me she was starting a literacy program for adult learners. A 65-year-old nurse was planning to open a wellness center for women over 50. A grandmother of 7 was launching a food truck business with her daughter. "You showed us it was possible," the grandmother said, grasping my hand. "You showed us that it's never too late to surprise people, including ourselves." But the most meaningful moment came when Chloe, now a freshman at the University of Iowa, approached me near the end of the evening. She was studying business and communications, and she had been following my journey with the kind of attention she had never paid to me before. "Grandma," she said, "I want you to know that you've changed how I think about aging, about what's possible for women, about everything. I used to think that getting older meant becoming less relevant, less visible. But watching you this year, You've shown me that maybe the best years are still ahead, no matter how old you are." She paused, looking around the room at all the accomplished women who had come to celebrate my honor. "I want to be like you when I grow up. Not just successful, but brave enough to reinvent myself completely if I need to." The conversation with Chloe made me realize that my transformation had achieved something I hadn't even intended. It had changed how my family understood the possibilities of aging. Jessica no longer saw me as someone who needed to be managed or accommodated. She saw me as someone who could accomplish things she had never imagined. Tyler, now a senior in high school, had started telling his friends that his grandmother was, quote, kind of famous and really cool. Even Brad had begun asking my advice about business decisions, recognizing that my entrepreneurial success had given me insights he could learn from. The ripple effects extended far beyond my immediate family. Second Stitches had become a destination for women from across the Midwest who wanted to learn about sustainable fashion and traditional crafts. My university classes were oversubscribed, with waiting lists of students who wanted to study with me. I had been invited to speak at conferences in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Kansas City, sharing my story with audiences who saw me as proof that reinvention was possible at any age. But perhaps the most significant development was the network of women who had started their own businesses or pursued their own dreams after being inspired by my story. They called themselves Second Stitches Sisters, and they had created an informal support group that met monthly to share challenges, celebrate successes, and encourage each other to remain visible in their own lives. Margaret Walsh, who had become both a friend and business advisor, had helped me establish the Dorothy Patterson Foundation for Women's Entrepreneurship, which provided microgrants and mentorship to women over 50 who wanted to start their own businesses. The foundation had already helped launch 12 new ventures, from a catering company run by a former school cafeteria worker to a pet-sitting service started by a retired postal worker. "You've created something bigger than a business," Margaret told me during one of our monthly strategy meetings. "You've created a movement. You've shown women that their experience and expertise are valuable, that their stories matter, that their dreams don't have expiration dates." As I reflected on everything that had happened since that anniversary dinner, I realized that the most profound change wasn't in my external circumstances, though those were certainly dramatic. The most profound change was in my relationship with myself. I had stopped seeking validation from people who were incapable of seeing my worth. I had stopped making myself smaller to make others more comfortable. I had stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The woman who had once been called invisible had become not just visible, but influential. My story was being used in business schools as a case study in successful entrepreneurship. My techniques were being preserved by the university for future generations. My message was inspiring women across the country to reconsider their own possibilities. But beyond all the recognition and success, what mattered most was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had refused to accept other people's limitations. I had taken the worst moment of my life, that humiliating anniversary dinner, and transformed it into the catalyst for the best year of my life. And the beautiful thing was, this was still just the beginning. At 70, I was more energetic, more purposeful, and more excited about the future than I had been in decades. I had proven that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, and I was just getting started. The woman they once called invisible had become impossible to ignore, and she was loving every minute of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.